Shalom and welcome to another episode of The Case for Messiah. I'm really privileged to have with me Dr. Erez Tzoref.
Hi.
My name is Seth Postel, and today we're actually looking at Hosea chapter 2, and specifically Paul's quotation and interpretation of that passage in Romans 9. And the question we have today, did Paul misinterpret Hosea chapter 2? And today we're going to make a defense for his reading.
So where do we even get that question? I mean, who's making the challenge?
Yeah.
That sounds unusual.
So as we're going to see, it's actually many times the way that the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, sometimes it's not always clear how, and that tends to be used as an argument that the New Testament is false, that it's lying. And so what we can do first, not reliable. So let's look actually at Paul's quotation, his interpretation, and then we'll look at the original context. So he quotes it in Romans 9, and just if you remember Romans 9 through 11.
Yeah, explain the context a little bit.
Romans 9 through 11, Paul is actually trying to explain God's plan to Gentile believers who had assumed that God had rejected Israel. God forbid, right? And so he's explaining to them the plan of God and the fact that the majority of Jewish people in the day didn't accept Jesus, that many Gentiles started to accept Jesus, and how in the end Israel would be saved. And so in Romans 9...
Which is, just parenthesis, I find it really fascinating because, these are questions that many Christians are asking today.
Correct. Absolutely.
So it's
absolutely.
essential we look at what Paul is saying.
And Paul's answer then is obviously our answer today. There's no difference. But Romans 9, 23 through 26, he says, "And did he, that is God, did so to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom he also called not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. As it says also in Hosea, I will call those who are not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God." So obviously Paul is quoting from Hosea. Now, let's give a little bit of a perspective on Hosea. Hosea was a northern prophet preaching to the 10 northern tribes, right? And basically the northern tribes had pretty much walked away from the Lord. And so Hosea's ministry ultimately was, in one sense, to pronounce judgment on the 10 tribes. They were going to go into exile, but also to provide them hope. And so the book of Hosea is not, the ultimate goal of Hosea is not to bring judgment, but also ultimately to focus on restoration. And so in that context, I've decided just to include a few verses in addition to Hosea 2:23. So we're going to look first at Hosea 1:8 through 10 to see this whole notion of not my people, my people. Okay. So when his wife had weaned Lo Ruchama, their daughter, not loved, she conceived and gave birth to a son, and the Lord said, name him Lo Ami. Lo Ami means?
Not my people.
Not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. These are harsh words that God says, right? Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it is said of them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. Now we'll go to our verse, chapter 2, verse 23. I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who has not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. And so...
Really interesting. So first of all, like many other prophets, the prophet's personal life becomes like a mirror of the place of the nation of Israel.
Correct.
But then it seems like to contradict itself, because God is basically saying, okay, there's a rejection, but then it's not complete or it's not forever. Basically, he says there's also a return type thing.
Yeah, I think that the obvious point here is that the exile is sort of almost like you'd almost consider it kind of a type of a divorce, kind of. But he's faithful to his promises, right? And he's going to win in this marriage to the people of Israel. He's going to defeat our stubbornness as a people, right? Because he loves us. He loves all people, and he uses us as a people to prove that he's faithful to his promises.
His own character.
But I think what's really important here for if we set the stage, it seems from the context that this is not referring to the Gentiles, right?
Right. And
the
Paul is applying it to the Gentiles.
Correct. And so the question then becomes, how does he do that? Like, what is Paul actually twisting the scriptures out of context? So because of these differences between the original context and Paul's application, those who basically oppose the New Testament, those that want to say that the New Testament is false, that Jesus is not really the Messiah, here's what they're going to say. They're going to say, number one, that Paul has completely twisted this passage out of context. They're going to say that this passage does not refer to the Gentiles. It refers to the people of Israel. And so they would argue that Paul can get away with this because he's writing to Gentiles that were once pagans that don't know the scripture. So he can
fool the Gentiles,
but
he can't fool us because we actually know the Bible.
Right. And so the point is that in this case, we caught you, Paul. You're a charlatan. You're twisting the Jewish scriptures. So
but is that really the case? I mean, that's a big statement.
It's a big statement
in the New Testament.
Correct. And so what we want to do is we want to see that these charges are unfair. And we're going to see it in a couple of different ways. And so before we actually, and I think if somebody's seriously weighing the truth of the New Testament, let's say from our people, let's say even of religious people that are searching to see if Jesus is true, if the New Testament is true, I would say before we actually cast stones at Paul, we ought to consider the Talmud's interpretation of Hosea.
Let's look at the Talmud then.
And here's what's interesting. What we see here is if the accusation of Paul is abusing the book of Hosea, he's taking verses out of context, that's kind of it's not a fair statement to make, because if we applied that to the Talmud, we would find that the Talmud often takes verses and applies them in very different ways than the original context.
So the Talmud, just to clarify, also for our listeners and those that watch the video, so the Talmud is an extra biblical piece of literature that was written by some of the best minds of our people, of the Jewish people. I mean, people that have literally devoted their life to study the Hebrew Bible as well, but really more the Gemara, the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Talmud, rather the Mishnah and the Gemara, which comprise the Talmud. And what you say is that actually in the Talmud, there's often the case where verses from the scriptures are taken and applied to support a certain argument. So if Paul does that in a, as we'll see, in a much smaller way, actually he does it in a very biblical way, we think, then the Talmud itself does it much, much more. And therefore, if they say the New Testament is not reliable, then the Talmud is, however more, not reliable.
Correct.
Type thing.
So let's look at an example from, it's a quotation of Hosea chapter 8, verse 10, and we're looking at Talmud Bava Batra, okay? And so it says, "And you have transgressed the words of the prophets, as it is written, though they have hired lovers, yitnu, among the nations, now I will gather them, and they will begin to be diminished by reason of the burden of kings and princes." With regard to this verse, Ula says, part of this verse is stated in the Aramaic language. The word yitnu should be understood here in its Aramaic sense, to learn. And the verse should be interpreted as follows: if all of Israel learns Torah, I will gather them already now. And if only a few of them learn Torah, they will be excused from the burden imposed by kings and princes. This indicates that those who study Torah should not be subject to paying taxes.
So in other words, the Talmudic interpreter says here, he takes the verse, he says, okay, there's one word in that verse that is not in Hebrew, like the rest of the book of Hosea, but it's in Aramaic, and he tries then to apply that verse to say, well, if you study the Talmud, then you're exempt from taxes, basically.
Correct. But anybody...
Very creative.
It's creative, and the bottom line is that anybody that's serious about the original context and the meaning of Hosea in its original context would find this application very difficult to accept.
Much more creative than Paul's application.
Correct. And in fact, we're going to see Paul is not even creative. But here's what's really, really amazing. So again, those who oppose the New Testament that specifically focus on Paul's use of Hosea chapter 2, verse 23, we've got to look at there's a Talmud portion called Pesachim. Passovers, right? 87b. And it's really amazing because what we see is within Jewish tradition that they actually understood that verse in a very similar way to Paul. Not the same, but very similar. So let me read the verse again, and then we'll read the Talmudic interpretation. So Hosea 2:23, again to remind you, verse 25 in the Hebrew Bible, 23 in the English, I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. Now here's from the Talmud. Rabbi Elazar said, the Holy One, blessed be he, exiled Israel among the nations only so that converts would join them. As it is stated, I will sow her to me in the land. Does a person sow a seed of grain for any reason other than to bring in several core of grain during the harvest? So too, the exile is to enable converts from the nations to join the Jewish people. And Rabbi Yochanan said that this idea may be derived from here, and I will have compassion upon her that had not received compassion, and I will say to them that they were not my people, who are not my people, you are my people. Here's what's really amazing. So here we see that the Talmudic interpretation is that by sending Israel into exile, they will provoke the Gentiles to jealousy. They will create a situation where now the Gentiles will hear about the God of Israel, will convert, and those who were not God's people will become God's people.
In much, much greater measure. Because he says the seed, I mean, you put a small amount of seed and it brings a whole lot of harvest. So it's really interesting. And it kind of, you and I talked about it before, it seemed to remind us a little bit of the book of Esther, where at the end it says that many of the nations of the land, had the fear of the Jews on them, and they've become Jewish themselves. So
exactly.
It's really interesting.
Exactly.
So that seems much, much more similar to the Pauline interpretation.
It's almost as if you're gonna throw out Paul here, then what do you do with this verse?
Two leading rabbis, absolutely.
Exactly. But here's where I think we'll disagree a little bit. So here, it's almost like the rabbinic interpretation is that the Jews provoke Gentiles to jealousy, but we're going to see that Paul has a very different understanding of who provokes whom to jealousy.
There's another side to this.
Exactly. Yeah. But now let's go back to Paul and let's look at him in the immediate context, okay? And I think sometimes people that want to dismiss the New Testament interpretation of the Old Testament, sometimes they do it too quickly. They need to read a little bit more carefully.
So it's done, I often feel that as well. It's done from an apologetic way and not from truly an attempt to truly wrestle with the text and come to an objective, conclusion. Okay.
Correct. So notice what he does say in terms of that verse. He says in Romans 9:23 through 24, just before he quotes the Hosea passage, and he said, and he did so to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. So
first of all, there are Jews and there are Gentiles, not just Gentiles.
Yes. So first and foremost, Paul is actually applying it to the Jews who accepted Yeshua in the first century, right? He's saying that this passage does apply to the Jewish people. He's not making it apply to somebody else.
That's right.
But what's surprising is he says, even the Gentiles. Even the Gentiles.
So where is he getting that from? So, I mean, where? I mean, Paul was very biblically based. Where's he getting it?
From Moses. We're going to see that he gets it from Moses. And so here's where we're going to see that the way that Paul understands the role of Jews and Gentiles, or Gentiles and Jews, is quite the opposite of the Talmud's rendition or version. And that is that he flips it, that the Gentile believers will provoke Israel to jealousy. So we're going to see that Paul gets this understanding from Deuteronomy 32.
Tell us a little bit about Deuteronomy 32. That's important, I think.
Wow. So Deuteronomy 32 in Hebrew is called Shirat Azinu, the Song of Moses. It's at the end of the Torah. It is one of the most incredible passages, I think, in the Hebrew Bible. Moses teaches Israel a song, and the song is basically telling Israel's history from entering into the promised land, from being disobedient, being cast out of the promised land, and ultimately being redeemed and being atoned for in the last days. And so it's a prophetic poem about how God was going to work and is going to work among the Jewish people, ultimately to redeem them. And Paul sees that the Gentiles in this final plan of redemption, according to Moses, have a very important part to play. So Romans 11:11 says, Paul says this, I say then, they did not stumble, that is Israel, so as to fall, did they? May it never be.
So that's the question and the very emotional reply.
Yes.
So Paul says absolutely God is not down with Israel because that would be denying himself. That would be contradictory to his own character. Okay, we don't have to go into that in depth, but I think that's important to note.
It's super important. It's super important. The Gentiles that he's writing to had concluded because some of the Israelites had rejected Jesus, that God had rejected Israel. And to him, it was a curse. May it never be, God forbid.
Right.
But now he's going to explain what God's purpose was in their rejection. But by their transgression, that is Israel's not
failure
accepting,
to recognize
right?
Jesus for who he is.
Correct. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. God wants...
So the Gentiles are going to make the Jews jealous?
That's what Paul says.
Where is he getting that idea from?
Exactly. And where is it from? He's getting it from the Song of Moses. So let's read Deuteronomy 32, verse 21. They have made me jealous. God is speaking, and he's speaking about the Israelites. They have made me jealous with what is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are not my people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Now, some people might say, Paul, you've totally misunderstood this verse, but actually we're going to see Paul totally gets this verse right, that's what the plan that God had to use Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. He totally gets it right. And we're going to see this for two reasons. For two reasons. The first reason is because of the parallelism in the verse. If we look at Deuteronomy 32, verse 21 again, God says, okay, you're making me jealous with what is not a God. You're provoking me to anger with your idols. In other words, O Israelites, I love you so much, and I want this exclusive relationship, like a husband and wife. I want this relationship with you, but guess what? You've decided to love
foreign gods.
Foreign gods. And it's provoked me to jealousy.
And that's I was going to say the normative, the normal, the right response.
Correct.
The loving response.
Correct.
Yeah.
God's provoked to jealousy not because he hates them. God's provoked to jealousy because he loves them.
That's right.
Right? So he says, okay, you've provoked me to jealousy by loving and cherishing no gods. So you know what? I'm going to provoke you to jealousy by loving and cherishing a no people. In the context of the parallelism of that verse, what it means is I'm going to make Gentiles
my people, and cause you to jealousy.
Wow. So that's the first reason. It's clear Paul gets this verse right. But the second reason is actually, if you look at the larger context of the song, at the end of the song, Deuteronomy 32, verse 43, it says this, O nations, cause his people to rejoice. For he will avenge the blood of his servants, and he will render vengeance on his adversaries, and will atone for his land and his people. Here we see...
Yeah, very interesting. So they're the same ones that are supposed to cause to jealousy in this verse, I mean, later in the prophetic song, supposed to cause Israel to rejoice.
So let me just say a word about the translation that I'm using. O nations, cause his people to rejoice. Actually, the New American Standard says, O nations, rejoice his people, or it's a hard verse to understand.
It is.
It is a hard verse in the Hebrew.
But I think that translation, the translation we have on the board actually carries the meaning of the Hebrew with the same grammatical structure.
Correct. In other words, this is our translation. And I've translated this because I think it's an accurate translation. I think what the Hebrew literally says is, O nations, cause his people to rejoice. Now, who are these nations that are doing this? The only possible answer to the identity of these Gentiles is found in verse 21. Those are the Gentiles that God chose, those who are not God's people.
His people.
Correct.
And are therefore now obeying him when he says, cause Israel to rejoice.
Correct. And so when Paul actually applies Hosea 2:23 to the Gentiles as well, he's doing it within the canonical context of the Torah.
He's listening to Moses.
He's listening to Moses. And so Paul is not distorting Hosea 2:23. He's actually demonstrating what an incredibly sensitive reader he is of the Hebrew Scriptures. So we should conclude.
Yeah. So what does all of that means for us, Seth?
Okay. So the first thing that we're saying, Erez, is that, first of all, to use Paul's quotation to argue that that because it's hard for me to understand that Paul's quotation of an Old Testament passage, or because a New Testament quotes an Old Testament passage and applies it in a way that's difficult to understand, it proves that the New Testament is false.
It's not reliable. Yeah, it's a very, very far-fetched claim, particularly if you believe in the Talmud.
Correct.
That it's done there a whole lot more than it does in the New Testament.
Correct. And to be honest, it's much easier to defend the New Testament's interpretation of the Old Testament than the Talmud's. Okay, and we're being respectful, but that's just the case. Second, we saw that the Talmud's interpretation of Hosea chapter 2 is almost the same as Paul's.
Very similar.
Very similar. So that the Jews actually bring Gentiles into a covenant relationship with God by being scattered among the nations. And so if we're going to throw out Paul's interpretation in Romans 9, then once again, people that would argue that, that follow the Talmud, and it goes both ways. It doesn't work.
Yeah, you can't just point at one. Actually, I think that'd be a very, very bad case. And I think you've also shown us very clearly that Paul's interpretation of Hosea 2:25 is actually very Mosaic. It's straight from the Pentateuch.
Correct. And that would be the third thing that we made, our third point, and that is that Paul's interpretation actually makes great sense when you read Hosea in light of the Torah. Paul not only gets Hosea right, he gets Moses right as well. And so, dear listener, dear viewer, we're just happy you've joined us today. And we just want to continue to encourage you to search the Scriptures to see if these things are so. We'd like to, again, encourage you, look and see. And as two Jewish people who love Yeshua, we honestly and truly believe that a careful reading of the New Testament, even more importantly, a careful reading of the Hebrew Bible, will lead you to the conclusion that Yeshua, Jesus, is in fact our Messiah. Erez, thank you so much.
Thanks.
If this touched your heart, will you help pay it forward to reach others who need to hear this message? Partner with our team to bring the gospel to Israel and the nations.